Bonjour à tous.
Good afternoon to all of you. Delighted to be with you for this session designed to a society dominated by males. I'm delighted to welcome you. I'm Aurelien VIERS. I'm the editorialist of La Provence, the regional magazine of reference. I will hand over to Emmanuelle AURIOL, who is a professor at the University of Toulouse. Welcome to all of you. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you. And we're going to talk about a thrilling topic. We have great panelists. So the question is, what is the cost of a male-dominated society? And by way of introduction, allow me to mention some figures. In 1945, no country in the world where men and women have the same rights. So this is how it started. According to the World Bank, 12 countries in the world have exactly the same rights as men, but according to the law, they have the same rights, and in other regions of the world, the situation is worse. In some regions of the world, there's an apartheid against women, and the women are discriminated against in the law, and this has an impact. Patriarchy, this structure of society has a key impact. So 2.4 billion women don't have the same rights as men. The other point that I wanted to highlight before I hand over to the great guests and panelists that we have today, allow me to talk about wage inequalities. And you have lots of inequalities between men and women. In 1990, wage inequalities, women will earn 50% less than men. Today, the figure is 30%, but the figure hasn't increased. It is capped. Women are penalized on the labor market, the child penalty, in fact. So we expect women to care for children more than men, so their career choices will penalize them. Why? So they will have a job next to the childcare facility. They will have a part-time job. I will refuse a promotion because I will have to move out. In the short term, it might not be mortiferous, but in the long term, this has an impact. And regarding the wage inequalities, the child penalty is high. Even though you adopt a child, I mean, you will get a child penalty. It's not a matter of biology, and the child penalty will change from one country to another. In Japan, it is quite high because if you consider the Japanese culture, it is quite traditionalist regarding the role of women and men, and in Finland, it's different. So we can act on that. But we are facing lots of obstacles. In France, there's another problem. The choice of higher education for girls. So inequalities start at a very early age, and women are less paid than men. They don't do the same types of jobs. Women won't embrace the hard sciences. Few women who are engineers or economists. I mean, for those who are listening to us, I mean, I encourage them to be economists. And of course, you can make a better living than being a psychology or studying law. That's why there are lots of wage inequalities. So you have part-time work. They stop their careers early. And when you consider the choice of higher education, you reach the 30% bar. So we will listen to our different speakers, and they represent different facets of this issue. And I will give them the floor without further ado, because their experience is great, irreplaceable. We'll be able to take stock of the situation. And of course, they will come up with some recommendations. Thank you, Emmanuelle. So, for example, Kudsia BATOOL, you are in you are working at the Trade Union Congress. Connecting the world means that we need to reduce the gaps. What needs to be done in the company in order to put an end to inequalities between women and men?
I will start by saying I'm really tired. I don't know if you know, but we had an election yesterday. We elected a new government overnight, and 14 years of some of the worst inequality that we have seen against women, against workers, will hopefully begin to be eradicated. So if I can't speak, just go with me. I'm a little bit delirious. But I do want to talk a little bit about what action is needed to combat the discrimination women face in society and in the workplace. Because without it, and we've seen this in the UK, we're only across the pond, so listen to us, right? We see a real rollback of the hard-won rights and progress at work. So I'm going to just remind you of the pandemic, right? That happened a couple of years ago. We're still coming out of it. And that taught us some real hard lessons. And it showed us the deep structural inequality which cuts across our country and our labour market, and highlighted basically the lack of equality women have. So whatever awful thing was happening in the pandemic, for people at work, it was worse for women. It highlighted that women were stuck in low-paid jobs, that women, there was massive occupational segregation, like Emmanuelle mentioned, and many women workers, particularly those in the vital jobs that kept our country going. We used to stand out on a Thursday night and we used to clap for them, right? Social care, retail, all those important jobs were paid poorly and treated badly. Nearly 2/3 of our key workers, so we have 10 million key workers, and 2/3 of those were women. And they kept the country going. However, and this is a matter of deep shame for us, that 2.6 million of those women were paid less than £10 an hour, less than the minimum wage in a pandemic. And that's only part of the issue. Women whose lives are shaped by other aspects of their identity. So black women, disabled women, LGBT plus women, women in insecure jobs, in zero-hours contracts and low-paid, they were really badly hit, and they are still feeling the effects of that inequality now. And it's no secret that in the UK, we have one of the worst gender pay gaps in Europe. Women work free for 2 months of the year compared to men. So they stop getting paid in October, and November and December we do for free like we do everything else. And we only know that because we have forced companies to say what the gender pay gap is, and it's a step in the right direction, but we're not saying, what are you doing about it? We're supposed to give them a pat on the back for saying, hey, there's a gender pay gap. What we should be doing is burning their feet because they're not closing the gap. But I'll talk more about that later. And we know that women will only start to get paid properly when we have better paid part-time jobs, better paid and more flexible jobs, and high wages in key sectors like social care. There is this myth that the jobs that women do are, unskilled, low work. It's not true. It's that they are victims of the patriarchy, and they need to be recognized for the jobs that they are. I'm a teacher. My old job, I was a teacher. I taught for 20 years, but I stopped teaching. And in the pandemic, I had to homeschool my son. I love my son. He's a great guy. That was the worst 6 months of my life. And it brought home to me how hard it is and how hard women have it. Because guess what, guys? You have to do it all. And you have to do it all while recognizing people don't think it's worth very much. And so we have to change that. Yes, by hearts and minds, but really by money in people's pockets. But it's not just about money. I'm not just going to talk about money. I'm going to talk very quickly about the other things that we need to address if we're serious about this. Women bear the brunt of all the care. Your kid is sick, you do it. You have to homeschool for 6 months, Kudsia, no matter how much you hate it, you do it. Your parents are sick, guess what? You do it. And it's at the beginning of your career, and it sets the inequality. Then you'd manage to claw some of that back, and guess what happens at the end of the career when your parents are a bit older, or your partner's parents are a bit older, then it's your turn again. And Guys, this is a really depressing story, but I promise you it gets better. I promise you. We know that women also are at an increased risk of domestic abuse. They face restrictions to access their sexual health and family planning services. We've seen that happen in America. Whatever happens in America, we like to follow them a few years later, and we're seeing the trickles of that. And any nationalist or far-right government that's elected will also go down that road, ... And we know that women are most likely to be affected by job losses, and they're always, first ones to be affected by redundancies, first one to be affected by cuts. Violence against women and girls is rooted in structural inequality. All of these things that I talked about, pay, about segregation, they are linked to violence against women and girls. You can't detangle those. And power imbalances between men and women are a main contributor. So if we're serious about addressing that, we have to be serious about women's work as well. And we know that sexual harassment and other violence against women happens on the street. It happens in workplaces, it happens in public spaces, everywhere. And I'm going to give you a really upsetting statistic. We did some research recently, and it said that 4 out of 5 women experience sexual harassment at work. 4 out of 5. However, we don't think that number's right, because it then said most women don't report the sexual harassment they experience. So that is a shocking statistic, and it is everybody's responsibility that if we want to make work better, then we have to eradicate that as well. And women aren't responsible for men, and we're not responsible for ending sexual harassment, but we have to come together to challenge male-dominated structures in work, in education, in our trade union movement, which is beloved to me, but it's full of men, and in public, digital, and government spaces. And our government, your government, and our trade union movement has to lead on campaigning for safer workplaces for women, free from violence and harassment, along with pay, along with pensions, along with terms and conditions. There can't be women's issues and other issues. There are only workplace issues. And where the government failed, our old government, we have got a new government, which is called the Labour Party. Now, we are the Labour movement, and the job of the Labour movement will be to hold the Labour Party to account, to be brave, and to start tackling the structural inequality.
Justement, Kudsia, BATOOL, merci pour votre intervention.
Thanks a lot for your intervention. You've talked about elections. You've alluded to those elections. The Labour Party won the elections. You talked about health as well. In the manifesto of the Labour Party, any measures for carers, for female physicians, for all those who work in the field of health to improve their working conditions? What is your take on that? Do you think that things will change with the new Labour Party at the helm?
So, yes, I do think they will change, and they will change significantly. The Labour Party have committed to what they are calling a New Deal for workers, and they have committed to implementing this New Deal in the first 100 days. So in 100 days, we are going to be seeing some significant changes, and it just so happens I have a list of them here. And I have a list because I'm going to check. Right? And I'm going to check, and I'm going to hold them to account.
Thank you.
So I'll go through them real quick.
Just one sentence to finish. Juste pour finir.
Just one sentence. Just one sentence to finish.
0 hours contracts. At the minute, women are employed on contracts, not guaranteed hours. Right? So if your shifts are cancelled, you don't get paid. They're going to end that. They're going to give day one rights against dismissal. They're going to stop women who are off on maternity leave being exposed to redundancy. So while women are off having babies, they cannot be sacked from their jobs for 6 months, which is really, really important. They're going to make sure flexible working is a day one right. They're going to make sure that parental leave is good quality and parents have access to it from day one. Sick pay, so women can be off sick when they need to without being penalized for it. They are going to look at paid carers leave. They're going to look at menopause for women.
Merci.
And so there's plenty. And yes, I think there will be a difference.
Merci pour votre réponse détaillée.
Thanks a lot for your detailed answers, and hats off to you.
Sylvain Denin, vous êtes directeur général et membre du conseil d'administration
So Sylvain Denin, you are the managing partner, CEO and board at Practice Europe and Africa, EDRIC and Struggles. So a male-dominated society, what is the impact in terms of governance and corporate governance? So allow me to talk about governance and the general management of companies. Of course, you need to consider the economy and the impact on the different economic stakeholders. But I will tell you a short story that does illustrate what women can experience in managerial positions in modern companies and in France. 1 month ago, one of our consultants was called by one of our customers in order to recruit an HR manager. The client wanted to have a woman. He was a man, the general manager of a listed company in France, managing a significant business. So he wanted to recruit a woman, so he greeted her. She's a Franco-English, a binational person. And the first sentence after saying hello to her, "Oh, you've seen the film, the movie, À nous les petites Anglaises." I don't know if you've watched the film. It's an old film. For us, the little English girls. This is the title of the film. So she felt undervalued, and she felt destabilized by a comment by a man who was 20 years older. And the second thing that she told me, she didn't want to embark upon this mission. So basically, no woman would like to accept this type of position. And I think this is about cost. There are lots of biases generated by unbridled masculinity. Today, we have a majority of women educated, talented women managing significant teams in companies, and I think that they don't want to go into environments that are unpleasant at best and at worst aggressive against them. So there are 3 trends that are being shaped. If you consider the senior executives that we discussed with, today, there's a talent war in order to recruit the best profiles, and the women who have those skills, who are educated, they can find companies that are quite progressive. And I think that this creates a distinction between the companies that are making progress, making some conscious efforts in order to curtail the biases that we've witnessed for many centuries, and the other companies which will become has-been companies, I would say. If you consider the young generations, men who are progressists, they are not eager to work in those environments, and the cost for these companies will skyrocket. So beyond this little story, there are lots of positive things in the corporate world, and France is a pioneer and is leading by example to a certain extent. The Copé-Zimmermann Act, whereby listed companies could get more than 40% of women in boards. This is a real success. The CAC 40 companies have 45% of women in their boards. And honestly, the companies are doing quite well, by the way. 33% of women in the executive committees, according to the law, it should be 40% by 2030. And today, there's a conscious effort that is being deployed by big corporations in order to promote women, to develop women within the organizations and corporations, and to help men understand their biases, and the objective is to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. It's a message of hope in France. This is a strong message in Europe because the European Commission enacted a law last year whereby there will be 40% of women in 26 countries in the boards. Lots of women will be able to join the boards of many European companies. Nevertheless, there's still a lot to be done. And when I prepared this panel discussion, I was shocked by a survey that was published by the European Commission in 2020 in technological companies funded by a private equity. 92% of the capital that has been allotted to companies where the managerial teams are male-dominated. And the French tech companies are lagging behind. Of course, they create jobs, they are innovative, they are the future of our economy, but they are lagging behind in terms of governance, only 20% in the board and less than 20% in their managerial teams. And I think that in a developed world, the only way to get more women in managerial positions is to make a constant and conscious effort in order to increase the number of women in companies. Just a sentence. So there are some great companies doing this effort. And of course, these efforts, should continue. So we've noted your example about the startups.
Des efforts à faire dans les startups.
There are further efforts to be made for the startups. Devika, you're an artist. You've worked on a number of issues such as feminist art and so on. I just want to go back to what Emmanuelle has just said. There are only 12 countries in the world where there are equal rights between men and women. 12 countries out of the 193 that are recognized by the UN. The leading country for that, in terms of executive leadership, there are 9 women who have been elected as heads of state and 13 women who are heads of government. So that's around 6 or 7% in a population which isn't actually a minority. In France, we deal with issues of women with all of the other rights of minorities. It's a human right that is not respected for a population which is larger than the population of men. It's more than 50% of the world's population that are women, and it's 50% of workers. I want to talk about this notion, feminicus economicus, that we mentioned. It's in the study by Goldwyn, Nobel Peace Prize, and she's recently been Nobel Prize for the Economy, and she showed us that there is a U-shaped curve which shows the invisibility of women's work. Not that the work doesn't exist, but there's a kind of a kind of glass ceiling. When we talk about someone who's a wife isn't seen as a worker. Instead, someone who's a wife will see their work becoming invisible, not only because she's working on domestic chores, but when she worked alongside her husband in the 19th, 20th century on a farm or something like that. These tasks, this work was never documented, and Goldwyn documented this work. It's an incredible study which says that women have always worked through the centuries, that there's a U-shaped curve. The lowest point was in around the 1930s, the early 20th centuries, where women were starting to see their work recognized, because it was no longer just manual work which was seen as degrading work, but it was increasingly recognized and valued as white-collar work, and women started to get into the world of business. So as UNESCO Artist for Peace and Ambassador for Peace, is to work on feminist diplomacy. First of all, let's stop our victimhood. It's a difficult thing because women have a lot of things to say about all of the many centuries of abuse and struggle for equality. But when I say we need to stop assuming a role of victim, we need to move forward with diplomacy, a feminist diplomacy. We're focusing on issue for education of women, girls and men, education in equality. We're aiming as well through this initiative to better understand how to give women financial independence. It's all about entrepreneurialism. This diplomacy also focuses on creating female role models to head up governments, and it's also diplomacy which aims to ensure that women are more present in negotiations. I initiated a project which is called the Sarah and Hadja Accords. They are the feminist part of the Abraham Accords. I knocked on the door of the governments in Morocco, United Arab Emirates. It was before the 7th of October, it was in May 2023, and I asked the women in those governments to sign up to principles of feminist diplomacy, and they did so. They were delighted to be able to stand together to commit to showing countries of the Middle East that it's possible for feminists to agree and move forward. After the 7th of October, things have been more tricky, of course, but our aim is to work towards African feminist accords, so with significant support from a number of African countries. We have 54 women that we're looking to bring together to sign these agreements, and we also want to put in place international agreements with the First Lady of Iceland. What I'm trying to do there is to try and create a different form of diplomacy. With the various successive crises, we can see that a different diplomacy is needed: artistic diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, feminist diplomacy, economic diplomacy, and through these means we'll create alliances between countries, alliances that will be different to the politically correct alliances that we try and manage through political and traditional diplomacy. That's what I believe in. We want to try and get things changed, not through civil diplomacy or purely political diplomacy, which is stuck in politically correctness. The results have been good so far. Thank you very much, Guila, KESSOUS. Feminist diplomacy in action. Let's now hand over to Devika Gopal AGGE, you're Vice President of the New York Women's Foundation, and you have carried out some very interesting studies into inequality between men and women, and you showed us some very interesting figures. You calculated that the gains for a more equal society would be $28 trillion. How did you calculate that? It's a fascinating figure.
Number, we shouldn't be sitting here talking about it, right? Just get those women out into the labor force. And yet only 2% of the entire global contribution of philanthropic funds goes to women funds and organizations. Of that, only 0.5% goes to women of color. The statistics seem overwhelming, and yet I come from a very small but mighty foundation. So I'm hoping that what happens in the States gets ported over. Where the New York Women's Foundation was set up 37 years back. We're a public-funded foundation, and we were set up by women, very forward-thinking women who believed that, you know, when you invest, that the problems and solutions live in the same place, and then when you listen to and invest in the solutions of women, we create the just world that we want to see, and all communities thrive. So you've heard all the problems, so I want to share an example of something we did, which I think had very positive implications for the labor market, for policy, and for creating a deeper bench of women of color to take the positions that we all want them to take. You know, back in 2015, President Barack Obama announced an initiative called My Brother's Keeper. On the heels of it, our mayor, Michael Bloomberg, announced Young Men's Initiative in New York. The idea of these funds was to elevate and opportunities for young men of color. No one was talking about women and girls. So the New York Women's Foundation partnered with the city government and partnered with one of our grantee partners, Girls for Gender Equity, and we set up the Young Women's Initiative. And because we're a philanthropic organization, we also set up the New York City Girls and Young Women of Color Fund, so that the initiatives of these young women would have funding, a funding pool with which they could invest in. We set it up as a 21-year fund, an intergenerational fund. The first 7 years of the fund, we did a study, and the idea was to invest in economic opportunities. We've invested $12 million in over 60 organizations, which has benefited on an average of 3.8 million young women and girls of color. But the bigger victory of the fund was that other women's foundations and organizations actually were willing to trial this model with their own city governments and with their own grantee partner organizations. So we supported them in doing it, and today we lead a national philanthropic collaborative of 16 women's foundations who are replicating this successfully. So what was so good about it? What was good was that we practiced what we call participatory grant making, and in the popular, I hate jargons, but the popular word in philanthropy is trust-based philanthropy, which means we trust our grantee partners and the young leaders of color and the Young Women's Initiative to tell us what this fund should invest in. We have a participatory table which is made up of donor partners, grantee partners, community, and they decide how to invest this fund. We have less burdensome reporting, because philanthropy is notorious for its reporting requirements, because we believe that because we, again, believe in the participatory and trust-based, so when we give the money to our grantee partners, we give it for 5 years and unrestricted. Some of the most positive results were a lot of emergent, women of color-led leaders. What was fascinating for us was that a lot of these leaders collaborated on their own across organizations for policy change. And we saw, and this was also a very fascinating time to set up a fund, right? This was the drama time of COVID, followed with Black Lives Matter, followed by political unrest, war, you name it, and we had all the spices in the mix. But despite that, these leaders managed to get immigration law. We have a very interesting law called DACA, which, where immigrant children would be separated from their mothers and given the same treatment. They forced the city government to revise DACA. So a lot of Asian and Pacific Islander groups who had been suffering from sexual abuse, they got a special act of $12 million with the city government actually setting up a special unit for them to address these concerns and to protect them. So there were a lot of laws coming out. These were not laws we could have anticipated. We knew there were problems, but the grantee partners, as they worked with the communities, found these problems on their own and found solutions, whether it was advocacy solution, whether it was movement building, whether it was organizing. And what was also very positive was that city government and the lawmakers had a better pipeline to understanding the communities that they represent and to find better laws to help them. So I'm going to stop here, actually, and give you some time back so that you can hear from memory. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On va passer à Memory KACHAMBWA.
We're going to move on to Memory KACHAMBWA. You're Executive Director of the African Women's Development and Communication Network, FEMNET. Why does men's domination contribute to reproducing a world of oppression and of inequality and violence? Can you explain why you see that?
Thank you so much for that. I think I'll start by really framing how the whole male dominance of power reproduces very oppressive but also very regressive kind of system. And I will really frame and center my contribution to the current broken global financial architecture system. So I think the first point is that we see how what we call toxic dominance patriarchy being reproduced in the extension of the colonial agenda, and how we see now in countries, for example, on the African continent, we still have countries which are still paying back to their colonial masters. So their financial monetary system in most Francophone countries are still using the franc, for example. And we see this, I think this is something that we need to constantly be challenging. And as African feminists, we have been doing a lot of work around the impacts of financialization. The second point is really to look at how, this patriarchy, toxic masculinity, if I'm to phrase it like that, is also impacting the cost to democracy. So we've seen an increase in an anti-gender, anti-rights movement, which is financed mostly by organizations and companies that are pushing for regressive policies. And we see how that is also impacting on the hard-gained rights that we have been, and freedoms that we have been fighting for. We see this on the African continent, but we're also seeing it, I think, in Europe. It's also growing. So we see it when we talk about protection of the planet, protection of a climate-just transition. It's actually the opposition coming from fossil fuel-funded, mostly owned by male, white companies, and ideology also pushing. And they are really pushing towards an agenda which is taking us back. So I think it's really important to also mention that the whole militarization that we see more budgets being allocated for military spending and no transparency as opposed to social services and for security and for peace. And when we talk about peace and security, we don't see much budgets. We actually see more cuts on that. And on this, I also want to talk about how the impact of these international multilateral financial institutions, and I'm speaking this because I think we're at a point where we see how the global financial architecture really is functioning and how it has effects. I live and work in Kenya, and for those that might know, we are actually going through a crisis where there was rejection of a financial bill. And in this financial bill, it's interesting that there were austerity measures being pushed because of the high debt crisis. Africa has got the highest number of countries in the debt crisis. Out of the 5 countries that have abstained from paying back their loans, 4 of them are on the African continent. And what we have seen is really how men who sit in decision-making seats are looking for costing at all costs, introducing and costing sanitary pads, introducing costs that are actually going to double. For example, levy on land. So if you own land, whether it's ancestral, inherited land, you have to pay a fee. And we know that most women do not have land, but they have access but not so much control. So what that means is that when there's a levy and a tax, and they're unable to pay, it's repossessed by the government. So this is going on the levels of the impact of such macro-level policies that we see. And I'll just share another example from my country, Zimbabwe, where we've also seen issues around sovereignty. We talk about intellectual property rights and trade, and how that, for example, in, let me say, Kenya, for example, there are laws that you can't exchange seas. So indigenous communities usually exchange seas, but now there's an intellectual property rights on it. In my country, we woke up one day and our government of Zimbabwe had given 70 million hectares in the form of carbon credit land. And this is about 20% of the land mass of the country. So decisions, I think there's a great interconnection around the reproduction of oppression by a system which is really driven by toxic masculinity and patriarchal ideology. And I think we need to disrupt that in solidarity. We need to continuously analyze it using feminist tools. You talked about feminist diplomacy, feminist foreign policy, which the government of France has actually signed up to. And I think there's certain ways in, I'll give an example, for example, in Burkina Faso, really using methods of economies like Ubuntu and some of those alternative economies that count women, that see women, that are inclusive, and that are also very much progressive. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Memory KACHAMBWA. Kudsia, BATOOL.
Kudsia, BATOOL, I saw you nodding as Memory was speaking. Can you hear the interpreting? Is it working?
Of Memory KACHAMBWA. Do you recognize yourself in these struggles, in this, in what you said?
Yeah, everything Memory said was resonating with the work that we've done, particularly around dismantling those structures and recognizing that it isn't, you know, when it's not happening in isolation, it is connected. The roots to it they're well funded, particularly when the oppression against women does come from the right, against women's reproductive services and health, against women's rights. You know, you can pull at the string of where that is happening, and a lot of what Memory said we have found in our research as well, and we are beginning, you know, we see the language. I mentioned we've had an election, and as you will know, elections are very fraught, and ours, you know, was played very dirtily, a lot of right-wing elements, and that language was very consistent with what Memory was saying and what we have seen in other countries as well.
Merci.
Oui, moi j'aimerais...
I would perhaps like to ask a rather provocative question on this point. If we look at the civil rights movement in the USA, for example, women tried to say there's discrimination against the black men, black women, but there's also discrimination against women in general. But people said to them, it's not the time to talk about that. Racial equality is more important, so we'll look at women's rights later. So I'm slightly unsure about this decolonial approach. Is it good for women? I'm wondering whether in some combats we're saying there are some priorities. The first thing is to renationalize economies in Africa, but we'll see about women's rights later. I'd like to hear what you think about that. I'm curious to hear what your point of view. I'm not sure whether these two combats are actually the same. Who would like to respond? Devika, GOPAL or Memory KACHAMBWA? Would one of you like to take the floor?
I think the deeper underlying thing, which is it's not about women or black women or men are bad. I think the bigger thing that we're all talking about is how do we change the culture and shift the narrative? We've all been brought up in these zip codes or postcodes, whatever you call them, of our birth. And we've all had a certain mindset. It's very hard for each of us to break away from that, to be open-minded, to actually think differently. Think about it. You go to school, you study subjects, and you're told that you have to stick in your lane. You go to do a job, if you're doing HR or business, you're expected to stick with that because there's a specialist to do something else. And yet when you go to your own house, you do everything. You're the generalist, right? You cook, you balance your books, you clean the house, you do everything. So that time you don't say, I'm sorry, I'm not a specialist in this, so I'm not going to do it. And it's hard, but that's what I was talking about, is applying a very intersectional lens to saying there is a problem and we need to solve it. And I think one of you made a point about there is a historic level of oppression, inequality, and equal wage. So in the United States, it's 0.3 cents for every dollar earned for a black woman. It's 0.4 for a Latina. It's 0.76 for a white woman. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? So there is a distinction by race. and we have to address it. You talk about reproductive rights, there is a difference. There is reproductive rights in general, there's intimate partner violence in general, and then there are certain communities of color who face more problems. So during COVID, that was the highest turnout. So I think you have to address it as a common thing. There has to be funding lines, but all of these narratives need to come together. It's not about either or, it is together. But I'm going to let Memory address it as well.
Yes, we'd like to hear you on that.
Yeah, I think for me, the first is to really recognize that societies are not homogeneous, and within that, there are different layers. In South Africa, for example, the apartheid government actually was borrowing, and that debt was passed on to the new government. And this is across most of the global South economies. So economies, even if they gained independence, there are still racial structures which still affect them in terms of participating equally in the global market share. And I think another issue is to see how different aspects affect different people in terms of social services. Kudsia talked about menstrual, that the Labour Party is going to have a menstrual, talk about, not menstrual, about menopause. And for me, it's because we have women who are in those spaces, and it affects people differently, people of color differently. So I think it's really to say the intersectional approach is so important because it allows us to be able to bring those debates, to be able to bring that in the discussions of economies. We run what we call the African Feminist Macroeconomic Academy, which sort of like tries to break down economies, because economy is seen as a subject which is complex, which doesn't affect the lived realities of women and girls in all their diversity. So within that is to also bring some of those lenses in the analysis.
Kudsia, BATOOL, vous vouliez réagir? Après, peut-être prendre une question dans la salle.
Perhaps one question from the floor. We've only got 5 minutes left. Kudsia, perhaps, first of all.
Quick, and I just wanted to echo what my fellow panelists have said. It isn't about either or. And one of the traps we do fall into is, you know, women struggle against the struggle against tackling racism, or black women struggle against white women's struggle. That's absolutely a trap we cannot get into. Devika talked about a really important element around organizing, around solidarity, and around unifying our struggles. And the fact is, if we can dismantle the systems that oppress one group of people, that is going to begin to have an impact for all groups of people. And that is a really important message, I think, that we should take away today. And that intersectionality of people is so important.
Thank you very much. Une question dans la salle, rapidement.
One question from the floor. What is the cost of virilistic behavior? I think it can be seen in the political world with the behavior of our French president, but I want to know that whether the behavior of people like President Trump or Mr. Putin or Netanyahu might go beyond socio-political analysis and be interpreted from a feminist point of view. Guila, would you like to respond to this? Thank you. It's a very interesting question. The cost of a male-dominated society is war. Why is this not said in the media? There are tens of thousands of women protesting outside the Kremlin to ask for their boys to come home. In Israel, there's Women Watch Peace, Women of the Sun, groups of Israeli and Palestinian women who are nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, who are working ahead of the 7th of October and since 7th of October for peace. In Liberia, we're seeing that women have made a difference in peace negotiation. And when I ask men who are in power why there are so few women in the negotiations, the answer comes very quickly: because they negotiate. Men want to win, women will negotiate, women find compromises, women think about how to make peace, men think about how to end the war. And I think that touches something on the masculine and feminine identity. Would you like to respond, Emmanuelle or AURIOL? Let's think about prisoners. 5% of prisoners are women, 95% are men. Violence may be linked to something biological, testosterone perhaps, but it's not necessarily a feminine response. I'm very impressed by what all of you are doing here. In businesses, I think the climate would work better if there were more women in power. We've talked about sexual harassment in the street. All of these things are societal issues. Feminist diplomacy is an answer to some of these questions, and there's a feminine way of managing conflict, deadly conflict in society. So I think all of these issues are relevant to businesses and to society. And let's just think about this statistic: 5% of prisoners are women. If there's no more questions, we're going to wrap up there. I want to thank all of our speakers. Thank you very much to everyone who's been here. One final question. We've got 1 minute left for our last question. There's a microphone here. Let's hear. Good afternoon. With respect to the theme of cost of male-dominated society, I don't have the cost for France, but in my country, Ivory Coast, Ivory Coast would gain 6 billion CFA francs if we put in place better equality between the sexes. If we achieved gender equality, we would, the society would be better. But are men aware of this? Are men prepared to let things go in order to achieve this equality? When I think about men, they've got two choices. Either they continue in the existing system and losing things in their economy, or they could move towards sexual equality and improve their country. So what can we put in place to help men understand that could improve the common good? Memory KACHAMBWA, do you have an answer to that? Yes, just before that, let's be aware of gender fatigue. I'm an executive coach and I go into businesses to coach men and women. 10 years ago, women were saying to me, I don't want to get in a lift at about 10 p.m. because I'm worried about a predator. But now I have men say to me, I'm worried about taking the lift at 10 p.m. because I'm worried there'll be a woman who might say to me, say that I had done something wrong against her. So this kind of tension after the Me Too movement is there. We're still talking about terrible rivalry between men and women, but what we should talk about is reconciliation. And I think it'd be really good to hear a man's point of view, to hear whether men would be ready to make concessions in businesses. I would like to give a message of hope because I see in our businesses, in the largest and most successful international businesses, there are some signals which suggest that there are some CEOs that are taking this problem seriously and are trying to bring men and women together, reconcile them to make things better. I think the Michelin tire company it's not a particularly feminine example. Tire making is not something that you see as typical female, but it's a company that's doing a lot for equality. They announced a worldwide decent wage and equal pay agreements for men and women, and this is something that's put in place by the leaders of the organizations. And just to respond to what the gentleman asked, from a political point of view, I think it would be the same things. If male leaders were to take this problem seriously, we might be able to move things forwards. Those that you mentioned probably are not in that category. You talked about an expression by Dr. Mukwege, Nobel Peace Prize winners who worked in the Panzi Hospital in Congo. He said, there is something called positive masculinity. There are men who are allies working to ensure women's rights, human rights, and this positive masculinity will help men to commit to working with women. That's going to be the last word. I want to ask everyone to applaud our panelists. Thank you very much.